Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope you're having a fantastic day. The first major is upon us. By the time you're watching this video, it is the day of the first matches. So in this video, I'm going to go through, we're going to break down who I think is going to end up winning these first round matches all the way through the grand finals. And then as the tournament goes along, I'll be back every single day giving you guys my breakdowns, my biggest takeaways, and who I think is going to continue to have success and who might end up falling out early from that lower bracket. So without further ado, let's go ahead. Let's get into our pick'ems, starting with the first match in the winner's bracket, which is going to be the Atlanta FaZe versus the Boston Breach. So when it comes to this matchup between the Atlanta FaZe and the Boston Breach, I have to start talking about Cellium. Right now, Cellium is the best player in my opinion. I think it might be arguable, but when you look at stats across the board, Cellium is playing absolutely amazing. And then when you fill out that roster with the Sims, with the Abizis, I mean, what Atlanta is bringing to the table right now is absolutely unparalleled. It seems like the first couple weeks of the season, we weren't even really talking about the Atlanta FaZe, but sure enough, they end up 5-0. They're going in as the #1 seed, and this is where they deserve to be based on the talent that they have. So on the flip side of that, when it comes to Boston, they've had a little bit of a different approach. So they come out and in preseason polls, they were ranked fairly high. I think a lot of coaches had them in the top 4 and the top 5 in those preseason coaches poll. Their first couple online matches, they get a 3-2 victory over LAG. They get a 3-1 victory over the Paris Lijan, and they're starting off 2-0. Couple that with the fact that they had a pretty high preseason ranking in those coaching polls. You just kind of think, okay, well, maybe Boston's for real. And then as of late, they lose 3-1 fashion to the Atlanta FaZe. They lose 3-2 fashion to Nysl. They end up losing pretty bad to OpTic. So in this one, I think Boston is far improved, and I think that they're performing better than people would expect when that roster was initially announced. But for me, I think Atlanta FaZe is going to be too much. Maybe Boston ends up getting an S&D or they come away with art, but overall, I think this is going to be a 3-1 victory for the Atlanta FaZe, which bumps Boston down into the lower bracket. Next matchup here, which I think is one that is super intriguing, has to deal with OpTic Texas versus the Seattle Surge. So in this matchup, just to kind of run through, I think this is when you're looking at this OpTic team and this Seattle Surge team, I think these are two teams that are on opposite sides of things in terms of how their year started and the momentum that they're getting. So when you think about OpTic, they did not have a great showing in the kickoff weekend. They came out, ended up losing to the London Royal Ravens 3-2, lost a map 5 round 11 to the Minnesota Rocker. So you're thinking, okay, this is not a great start for OpTic. What is wrong with OpTic? And then they come back and they get a win over Paris, which you would expect, get a win over the Toronto Ultra, even though they were playing a sub at the time. And then they get a 3-1 victory over Boston. So this is a scenario where I feel like OpTic started off not too hot. And then as the first few weeks of online qualifiers went along, they started to put things together, and now momentum is rolling with them a little bit. Whereas on the flip side of things, you're talking about the Seattle Surge. Yes, they were 3-2. Yes, they're starting in the winner's bracket, but they had a phenomenal kickoff classic. Everybody remembers just how impactful they were in that kickoff classic. Sib and Pred were absolutely just frying no matter what game mode they were playing. And then they come into the online matches, get a 3-0 victory over Nysl, end up getting a 3-2 victory over the Toronto Ultra, get a close map 5 victory over the Minnesota Rocker. And then you started to see things slow down a little bit. So they end up losing 3-0 to the Florida Mutineers, which that's one that I feel like took everybody by surprise. And then they end up losing 3-1 to the London Royal Ravens. So when you're looking at how these teams have, what their journey has been like throughout the first 3 weeks of online qualifiers and the kickoff classic, to me, it just seems like OpTic is playing better right now. And when you put them on the main stage, I think it's going to show up, and this is their home tournament. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go 3-1 here. I don't think it's going to end up getting to to map 5. If it were to get to map 5, I might put that in Seattle's favor. So that might be something to watch out for. But initially, I'm going to say OpTic 3-1 here. Moving on to the next matchups, we have the London Royal Ravens versus the Los Angeles Guerrillas. When it comes to the London Royal Ravens, 4-1 overall, ended up getting or being tied for that 2 seed. And the only match that they lost was to this LAG squad. So kind of keep that in mind. They have wins over OpTic. They have wins over Rocker. They have wins over Seattle. So when you're looking at the path that London has had, they've been playing really well. And on the opposite side of that, LAG is coming in at 2-3. But again, they've been playing a bit better as of late. They did get a win over this same London squad, then ended up going to map 5 against the Minnesota Rocker. But the one thing that I'm taking into consideration here is just who is on these 2 rosters. And when it comes down to it, this is the very first major. Now, if it was major 3 or major 4, I think things might be different. And I said this on the Rotation podcast when I was on with the Minnesota Rocker. I just feel like when you have Slasher and you have Gunless and you have Asim and you have Hook, and when it comes to playing online, these guys, or when it comes to playing on land, these guys have been here before. Nothing is going to be too bright, right? The lights aren't going to be too bright. The scenario is not going to be too bright. I just feel like London is a scary squad that in a first round matchup, they're going to come out and turn up. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go 3-2 here for LAG. This is my first game 5, but I do feel as though LAG could clutch up and come away with this one, even though London is playing unbelievable. I don't want to take anything away from London. If they win this series, I will not be surprised whatsoever, but I just feel like there's something telling me to go LAG here. And then the last matchup here in the first round, we've got the Los Angeles Thieves against the Toronto Ultra. And this is one that is kind of a tale of 2 different stories here. So when it comes to LA Thieves, they finished qualifying with a record of 4-1. The only team that they lost to was the Atlanta FaZe. But when you look at the teams they've beat, NYSL, the Florida Mutineers, the Paris Legion, and they did get a victory over the Toronto Ultra. So when you look at the teams that they have played, okay, they're 4-1, they're frying. When it comes to hardpoint, they're 8-2 on the season in hardpoint. All that bodes well until you take a peek at who they have played and what those records look like. Whereas on the flip side of that, Toronto Ultra is 2-3, but they've played the majority of their qualifiers with a substitute, and I think that's going to have a big impact in this. I feel like when you put these teams on land, when you think back to last season, for me, all the way throughout Black Ops Cold War, and even a little bit towards the end of the previous season in Modern Warfare, in the CDL, Toronto has consistently been, for me, again, the number 2 team in the CDL. I feel like from the beginning of last year to the end of last year, you could say, yes, consistently Atlanta was the best, but Toronto was right there the entire time. And in this one, when they're playing on land and their squad is back together, I just got to give this one to the Toronto Ultra. Now, I think what it'll come down to is those hardpoint maps, because historically Toronto is an unbelievable S&D and control team. So the LA Thieves have an 8-2 hardpoint record so far, which we've already mentioned, but they cannot lose one of those. If they lose a map 1, I think it's history from there. And if it goes map 5, I feel like how is LA Thieves going to end up beating Toronto Ultra in a map 5? So I'm going to go 3-2 here, which is going to advance the Toronto Ultra and send LA Thieves down to the losers bracket. Now, losers bracket, I'm not going to take quite as long with these predictions. I will touch a little bit on the teams that I haven't mentioned so far. So, for example, the Florida Mutineers, when it comes to Florida, they're 2-3 so far. Their victories are against the Paris Legion, and they did get that last victory against the Seattle Surge. So they do kind of have a couple impressive victories here, but I'm just not quite sure they're ready for this. I think the roles and how many main AR, or at least AR heavy players they have, I think that that's messing with them in a similar way that it's messing with the New York Subliners. So when it comes to Florida versus Boston, I'm going to give the edge to Boston here in 3-2 fashion, which sends them along and sends home the Florida Mutineers. Next matchup here, we have got the Paris Lijan against the Seattle Surge. When it comes to Paris, they're 0-5. So there's not really a lot to look forward to here. They did end up making a roster move, brought in Tom Gravity and dropped Decimate, but I'm just not quite sure it's enough to propel them forward into one of those top 6 teams, maybe even top 8 teams. I think they have way more to fix than just switching out one player. So I could see this sadly being a quick 3-0 and Seattle moves along. Next matchup, London Royal Ravens versus the Minnesota Rocker. Minnesota comes into this at 2-3, but when you look at who they've played, they got a win over OpTic, lost in round 11 against the Seattle Surge, lost to London, who looks like one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the game right now, lost to the Atlanta FaZe, and then got an impressive victory over LAG. So when you look at their opponents, they have played, I mean, if you're looking at Atlanta and London, and I think you consider OpTic in the top 5 or 6 right now, when you look at who they've played, LAG probably top 6, top 7 at the worst, they have played the toughest schedule so far. So yes, they're starting in the losers bracket and the record may not come out and really do them any justice, but we know they're a great S&D team. All they have to do is come through in either a hard point or a control, and if you're a 2-3-5 team, you can absolutely make a run in this, and that's what I think is going to happen. I think that they stretch this to map 5 and London gets the victory here. All right, and then last match of the day, LA Thieves versus NYSL. I just feel like NYSL is in trouble. I said at the beginning of this roster mania period when it was rumored that Clay and Krim were going to be coming together, I thought the game would be too fast for them. They wouldn't have enough pace on the map. In 5v5, those two could coexist, but in 4v4, where everything is so important and pace is so important, it's just not working out for them. When you talk about game modes, they are 0-9 in hardpoint. S&D, they're okay. Control, they're okay. But if you can't win the hardpoints, maybe they steal map 2 or map 3, but I'm going to give this a 3-1 in favor of the Los Angeles Thieves. So let's go back up to the winner's bracket here. We're looking at the winner's bracket round 2. We have got the Atlanta FaZe versus OpTic Texas, and this is a super intriguing matchup. Again, I feel like Atlanta is the best team in the game right now, so they're going to come away with this in 3-2 fashion, but I think that this might be the place where OpTic finally finds themselves coming into this season with the players that are on that OpTic roster. When you look at Shotzi, you look at Dashy, you look at Illy, those guys have played tens of thousands of rounds of S&D. So when you think about OpTic, you don't expect them to be struggling at S&D, and that just happens to be where they are at right now. So I think that they're going to get it figured out in Major 3, Major 4. I think this is going to be a different story. Of course, they can compete in the respawns, just maybe not yet with the Atlanta FaZe. So I think they're going to give the FaZe a run for their money, but I just don't see them come out on top here. And then the second round other matchup here is the LAG versus the Toronto Ultra. And again, I think that they are just, when it comes to Toronto, not only the skill, but their teamwork, their composure. When you watch these guys play on LAN, it is a different style. And that's one of the things that I like so much about Toronto. Whether they win, whether they lose, they act the exact same way. And as somebody who has been a head coach for more than a decade of my life in traditional sports, I have a lot of respect for the way that they carry themselves. And I think it contributes to a lot of their success. So I'm going to go Toronto Ultra here in 3-1 fashion, moving them along and sending LAG down to the losers bracket. In the losers bracket here, Boston Breach versus Seattle Surge. I'm going to give this to Seattle. I think it's going to go map 5, but we know how good the Seattle Surge can be in map 5, especially when you've got the Iceman accuracy. And then the next matchup here, Minnesota Rocker versus LA Thieves. I'm going to go 3-1 fashion for LA Thieves. I think Minnesota probably wins the S&D, but as of right now, in hardpoint and control, they just can't hang with some of these top 4 or top 5 squads. They'll get it figured out. I have a lot of confidence that they'll end up getting it figured out, but right now, I just don't really see it happening. Moving on here to the winners finals, Atlanta FaZe versus the Toronto Ultra over here on the right-hand side of our screen. When it comes to this matchup, Atlanta FaZe, Toronto Ultra, these are just who I happen to think are the 2 best teams in the CDL. But when it comes to the Atlanta FaZe, I'm just not quite sure that there's anybody that can hang with them yet in all 3 game modes. I've already talked about how Celium's the best player in the world right now, and you couple that with Simp and Abizi, who I don't want to say has carried this team, but they've definitely been in previous years the 2 standouts for this Atlanta FaZe squad. But right now, that's not the standout player on that roster. It's Celium, and then you have Arceus. They're just so well-rounded, and they fit the meta of this game so well. I'm going to say this is going to be a 3-1 fashion. A lot of it is because Toronto hasn't had a lot of time to play together yet. Going into the year, they were behind on scrim time, and then they had to play with a sub throughout some of these first 3 weeks of online qualifiers. So you couple all that together, I just don't think they're there yet, but they're going to get there eventually. So winners finals, I'm going to go ahead and give that in 3-1 fashion to the Atlanta FaZe. Kicking back down to the losers bracket here with elimination round 3, we have LAG versus the Seattle Surge. And again, I just feel like when it comes to a situation like this, you want to talk about guys that are locked in. Yes, I know Pred, I know Sib have looked phenomenal, but they looked phenomenal at the Kickoff Classic in the first few matches of online qualifiers. As of late, they have not been playing the same the same way, and I just feel like Slasher is going to be locked in. Asim on LAN is a different player. We saw that last year with NYSL. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to say this is going to be a 3-1 victory for LAG, which is going to send Seattle home and move LAG into elimination round 4. And we have a matchup here between OpTic and LA Thieves. Now, for this one, it's going to be who ends up clutching up in the search and destroys, because that's the game mode that you have to have a bit of question on when it comes to these 2 teams. Obviously, the hard points and the control are going to be an absolute bloodbath back and forth. But right now, I feel like if this is the 2nd or 3rd match here that OpTic has played, I think they're going to start to figure it out, but it won't be enough. If it goes map 5, I've got the ice here from LA Thieves, from Envoy, from Kenny, from Draza, from Octane. I just think right now they're a little bit more talented overall and a little bit further along in S&D. So I'm going to go LA Thieves here, sending OpTic home at their own major. Elimination round 4, LAG versus LA Thieves. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to give this in 3-2 fashion if it goes to map 5 to LA Thieves, which brings us to the elimination finals, Toronto Ultra versus LA Thieves. Again, it's going to go map 5, and Toronto just has the ice. We've talked about their roster kind of all the way from the top down, but one thing we haven't mentioned yet is the clutch factor that they have from Cammy, Kleenex, Insight. And when Bance shows up, we saw last year in Black Ops Cold War, when Bance shows up, he has the ability to come out and Toronto can win a championship if he plays at his highest potential. We saw that last year in Black Ops Cold War. Now, in this year, you know what you're going to get from Cammy. You know what you're going to get from Kleenex. You know what you're going to get from Insight. Even though he was a rookie last year, those 3 always played to expectations. So I'm going to go 3-2 the Toronto Ultra here, which brings us to the final matchup here in the grand finals, the Atlanta FaZe versus the Toronto Ultra. It just happens to be who I think are the 2 best teams in the CDL. And if I called it this way earlier, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to call it again. I just feel like Atlanta FaZe is too much. Maybe Toronto's able to compete in the S&D, but when it comes to respawns, I just think right now the Atlanta FaZe is ahead of the game. So I have the Atlanta FaZe winning this. And actually, I just saw that this is a best of 9. So Atlanta FaZe winning 5. I'll say just based on the fact that there are only so many maps out there, right? The map pool is only so big. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to say a 5-2 fashion here for the Atlanta FaZe. So those are my pick'ems for the first major, the OpTic Texas major. Let me know down below. Do you think LA Thieves is going to make a run? Do you think Atlanta FaZe is going to get upset? Do you think you could see OpTic Texas making noise in their own home series? All of that stuff, please leave it in the comments down below. I hope you enjoyed this. Check back every single day for a recap, an adjustment to these predictions, and who I think is going to be playing better as the days go along. So make sure you check back, subscribe, as it really helps out the channel. Hit that like button. And with that, guys, thank you so much. Enjoy Major 1. Make sure to stop back for all the recaps.